Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AKA Hotel Residences Corman Communities, Ariel Property Advisors, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Mortgage Lending, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Casamatides Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Ocean First Bank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, Stonehenge NYC, SVN CPEX Real Estate Services, Tierra CRG, the Meringer Family Foundation, and these friends. My name is Michael Stoller, host of the Stoller Report. Today is celebrating the 20th anniversary of my broadcast. And today we're talking about what's happening in the residential rental market in New York City. My guests today include the eminent Ofer Yardeni, the chairman and CEO of Stonehenge, New York, Andrew Levison, who is the principal at Dermot Companies, Daniel Parker, who is the managing director at Hodges Ward Elliott, and last but not least, John Houston, who's the CEO of Midwood Investment. So, Mr. Yardeni, since you are always the most positive individual here, yesterday before the show, I started reviewing everybody's website and certain competitors' websites, talking about free rent, what's happening.
I think that really in order for us to understand the market today, where we are today, we need to really see where we were in January, February of 2020. At my leasing team in February, our occupancy was 98.9%. Demand was tremendous among our 3,000 units, 5,000 tenants. And we were all planning for the leasing season that will be June, July, and August. We expected that we will increase rent between 4 to 5%. And the headlines in New York City will be crisis in the multifamily, the rent is too high, no apartments are available, and all this as a result of the new changes in the administration that they did between rent stabilizing and fair market. Where we are today, the headlines are crisis in the multifamily, but instead of increasing rents by 4 and 5%, we are experiencing tremendous vacancies in our portfolio. And I'm sure that what I represent is what's going around the city. The fair market units in New York City and Manhattan are experiencing a decline of rents, and the velocity is not there. I would say that the typical landlord will have somewhere between 15 to 20% vacancy instead of having 98, 99% occupancy. I have been in this business for the last 25 years, and I can tell you that I have never seen in any cycle that we had what we see today. It's not that it's a financial crisis with our tenants because they are all employed, Their average income in our unit is around 250,000, and they didn't lose the job like any other cycle. But what really happened is when the leases when the leases matured, our tenants made a conscious decision, because they are more the affluent one, to vacate the units and move to their parents in the tri-state area, and some of them left the entire state. In addition, we and many landlords are relying on the colleges. 15% of our units are being leased to students, high-end students that are paying between $3,000 to $6,000 a month. Those students, because of universities and colleges, are still not open physically, and therefore we are experiencing tremendous slow in velocity. So that's where we are today. During COVID, because I believe we are the leading company in terms of technology in the multifamily, we were able to lease close to 200 units in our portfolio. These units were rented without being inspected. They trusted the brand. They saw the units online. They got their application, got approved, signed the leases, and they are moving in. Many of the landlords in New York do not have the capability and the technology that we have. And I will not be surprised that some of them are experiencing 25, 30, and 35% vacancy in the firm market. So that's where we are today. And we are all geared towards the end of the month, as we believe that more and more tenants will come back to the city as the weather will change and people are looking forward to come back to work from their offices.
I'd like to pose the same question a little bit to John. John, you have multifamily all around. Besides New York City, you're in many states. How do you see the multifamily residential rental here as compared to some of the other states that you're involved with?
It's much different. And that's because the epicenter of COVID was first in New York. And, you know, this is really about what people do when they're under stress and they're fearful. People are like any other kind of animal. We are migratory. And this is really about whether there is a change in migration patterns or is this temporary. And if you look at pandemics throughout history, the wealthier populations have always fled the city. You know, if you look at Naples, for example, in 1650, when the bubonic plague started in Naples, all the wealthy Neapolitans left the city, and when the plague abated, they came back. The question is, how much of the population in New York will leave permanently versus how much will come back? In our portfolio in Philadelphia, we've seen no effect whatsoever, and that's because that population is much less wealthy and much less mobile. In Los Angeles, our property there has seen a big decline in vacancy, more than any other building in our portfolio, and that's primarily because it's more workforce housing and younger people, and they've moved back to home or lost their jobs. So that market, at least for workforce housing, is much more challenged than the luxury market.
Andrew, you have a significant number of apartments. And where do you stay in today, and how does the Dermot Company look? Because you have different locations in different areas. You have Brooklyn, and then you have the far west side near the Hudson Yards. So how do you see the world?
And Michael, thank you for having me on the show. Similar to what Ofer said, you know, we found that during the opening months of the pandemic, we had to be incredibly responsive and incredibly flexible in figuring out how to lease in a new environment and how to manage in a new environment. We've actually seen that our portfolio of properties that are not currently under construction or renovation are averaging leased occupancy rates between 90 and 96% today. And I think that I agree with Ofer, that's higher than average. We're hearing anecdotal evidence of folks who are over 20% vacant. And I think that's a testament to our responsiveness to the market. We think it's our goal every day to rent apartments at whatever the market rents are, and not to wait for what the future may or may not hold. And so similar to Stonehenge, we created online leasing tools, virtual tours. We allowed people to tour without leasing agents. We still do if they prefer. So we've been able to keep our occupancy pretty stable across the portfolio. The exceptions of the buildings where we chose to renovate units and we took additional vacancy in preparation for that. And the Buchanan is an example of that.
We have 3 owners and we have 1 investment sales. Daniel, you've been selling in this period of time. Most people say there aren't that many sales taking place. So where do we really stand with investment sales? And I know that all of you are active in investment sales. So Daniel, why don't you give us your opinion of what's happening in the investment sales?
Well, the investment sales market is down. There's no denying that the demand right now is really slow among the sellers, right? So the desire for sellers to go into the market, a lot of owners are feeling that now is not the best time to sell. And in the meantime, there is a handful of investors that remain very active in the market. They're looking for deals, and the biggest complaint that they share with me is that there's nothing to buy. And so I think that at the moment, the story of vacancy is dominating the narrative around multifamily in New York City. And what I'm sort of pointing out is that I recently had a conversation with the CEO of a company that handles a lot of moves and coordinates the moving. So they have really interesting data as to where people have been moving and what consumer behavior is among the people moving. What we're seeing is the vast majority of people moving out of their New York City apartments right now are going into storage. They're not moving out of state permanently. They're not leaving forever. They're simply putting a timeout on their time paying rent, and it's because they're probably working from home. So the investment sales market right now is probably overly focused on the vacancy rate, and rightly so, it's a concern. But there is reason for optimism in the data that a lot of these tenants who moved out have intentions to move back in as early as the fall, or maybe in the later part of 2020 and into the early part of 2021. It's really going to depend on when employers start to tell their employees it's time to come back to the office and the work from home model.
One of the sales that you took care of was in affordable housing. This is a question for everyone. What's the opinion of buying a building today which has mostly affordable as opposed to market rate? Andrew and John?
I think it depends on what you mean by affordable housing. We have been in the rent stabilized space, largely exited that business and focused on mostly market rate housing in buildings that have 20 to 25%, sometimes up to 50% income restricted housing. We think that's a fantastic business. It provides housing for people who need it in high quality buildings. We built buildings and purchased buildings in those programs. It's a revenue stabilizer, but the reality is to meet increasing operating costs, including increasing real estate taxes, water and sewer bills, et cetera, you have to have rent growth. And the rent growth needs to come from somewhere. So regardless of whether it's low or middle income housing or market rate housing, as long as operating expenses are going up, you need to be able to underwrite revenue growth.
Okay, all of you have looked at properties in emerging neighborhoods. Ofer, you even finally left the borough of Manhattan and went to Long Island City. How do you know? I know that John has Brooklyn. Andrew, you have Brooklyn also. How do you look at the boroughs today with regard to the fact that we still have COVID, we don't have a vaccine, and it's more difficult for people who are living in the boroughs to get to Manhattan on the train if they want to come in? How do you see Long Island City market?
So I was very cautious when I went to the Long Island City market. As you know, Michael, I stayed for the last 25 years here in the city and buying multifamily. And when we acquired the building with Carlyle, I was very, very surprised by the demand, the capacity to increase rent, and the tenants that rented in this building. Typically, it's Studio One and very few two. And during COVID, when it started, I was very cautious about this building and I paid a lot of attention because I didn't have the experience to see what will happen in the boroughs. But to my surprise, one QPS performed the best of the entire portfolio. The building stayed in the high 90s occupant. And I want to mention something to Andrew that he says that people have 90 or 95% occupancy. I think that what happened in Manhattan is most of the buildings have at least 10, 20% rent stabilized in their building. And people are calculating their vacancy based on the entire building versus I calculate my vacancy on my fair market because the rent stabilized they don't live. And if you really calculate it based on your fair market, you see that the vacancy is a lot larger than people tend to report. Long Island City, we still are getting tremendous amount of students from China, and they are coming straight to the building, renting units online, and I did not see any resentment for people to take the subway or any other means of transportation. Our building currently, even though they are 85, 90% occupied, physically, they are only 50% occupied because most of our tenants, they have a choice where to go. And they go to their parents. And it's true what Andrew said about storage. A lot of them, because of technology, decided to pay storage $250 a month and move to the Hamptons or Westchester or any other parts of the tri-state to be with their parents, and they save rent and they will come back. So they didn't have intention to leave the Manhattan or the boroughs. And we follow where we send a security deposit. And we find that most of the security deposit that we send to their parents in those locations. So it's not the tenants moved for apartments in other places in Manhattan. They just left. And we believe that they'll come back.
Here's the question. Do you think certain people who have left, who have maybe decided to go up to New Rochelle or to Yonkers or parts of New Jersey, will have left permanently or they will be returning?
The people that you are talking about, the singles that moved to New Rochelle, I believe that they will turn back to Manhattan. We are talking about some families that have desire to move to the boroughs or to the suburbia, and they have a kid or they are thinking to have kids. Some of them left, and I believe that they will stay there for a year. Some of them rented, not necessarily bought. And I believe that after being a year or 2 years in the suburb, they'll come back to Manhattan because you can't fight the trend of urban living. On the contrary, I believe that you will see more and more development and more desire of people to live on 51st Street or 58th Street or 56th Street, where you don't need even to take the subway, where you can just walk to work. That will be really the huge demand. And I believe that the Hudson Yards and all the areas that were suffering because of a lot of concession, those areas where you can walk to work will do better than the areas that are proximity to the subway, because people will be a little bit concerned as American to go in the subway. It's not in Asia, people are taking the subway, but here people are more cautious. So I think that the trend will be to come back to New York, to live in New York, and to be in Manhattan, and to walk to work, and to work from the office, if either full-time or part-time.
Okay, all of you, Andrew, John, Ofer, all own retail within regard to the properties that you have. John, you have more retail, I think, in New York City than you have residential. What's happening with the tenants in your properties paying rent with regard to retail? John?
So it depends on the type of property. Portfolio wide, in terms of our commercial tenants, we're around 72, 73%. We're seeing a gradual recovery. But it really comes down to property type, tenant type. So our convenience retail and transit oriented retail has been the slowest to recover. The essential retail, like banks, cell phones, supermarkets, pharmacies, have done very well. But our occupancy coming into this was, in our retail portfolio was 95, 96%. We have high street retail, we have main street retail, we have local retail. And the interesting thing is that we're seeing, decent, and shopping centers. We're seeing actually fairly good demand. We've been able to sign leases. We just signed a lease with Burlington Coat Factory and Walgreens and several others. So it's very site specific, but make no mistake, unless you have the best corner in the market, you're going to have trouble leasing your space during these times. And we do expect significant rent declines.
Andrew, you have substantial retail also. What's happening with your retail?
Yeah, it's been challenging. And I'd say, we're spending a lot more time on the asset management front, dealing with our retailers and trying to get them on, reasonable modifications to their leases that allow them to survive and keep in business post-pandemic than we are on a lot of the rest of our business, even though the retail is a small percentage of our revenue. Similar to what John said, I think it's very location and user specific. We're, pick a building. We have a range of, some buildings we're collecting 20% of the rent, and we have one building where we've collected 100% of our retail rent throughout this whole period. And it's just a matter, and that building includes a restaurant, by the way. So it's, it's very heavily based upon, is it neighborhood retail that's been able to stay open, been able to serve the local population. And, we've got tenants like, a high-end yoga studio and a cycling studio. They're mandated closed by the government. So they don't have any business. They don't have any revenue, and they're still forced to be closed. So we've seen a range. We've been, flexible, and we've tried to be helpful to keep our retailers in business because we think it's an amenity to the residential portion of the building more than anything else. And we want our storefronts to stay occupied. We want our businesses to stay open, reopen when we get to the other.
So, Michael, with respect to the retail, some people think that COVID-19 is the reason why retail is not doing well in New York City or around the country. And I think that the retail tenants have been suffering in the last few years for several reasons. One of them is the e-commerce, the Amazon and the other companies that were able to provide to the consumer, not necessarily to go to the shop, but to have everything delivered. And second, let's not forget that our administration raised payroll from $7 to $15, the minimum, which really killed a lot of retail operators because they needed to provide larger amount of salaries, and the same thing with the garage. And they needed to provide healthcare to those employees, of which really affected the retail. So retail have been in decline, if you ask some of the landlords, in the last few years. COVID-19 is really another nail in their coffin. And I can tell you that I believe that rents in retail will decline by 50, 60%. I think that the rents that were on the First or Second or Third Avenue that they used to be $300 are going to be $150, $125. I think you're going to see more neighborhood, either restaurants or shop that will cater to the neighborhood. So retail has been really suffering. I think that we lost 50 to 60% of our retail during COVID. And guys, let's think about it. A restaurant or a gym cannot support themselves for 3, 4, 5, 6 months without revenues. So even location like Greenwich Village, we lost the 80% of our retail on Downing Street. We lost 50% of the tenants on 14th Street.
I wish we had more time today to discuss the market. I hope that all of you will come back in a couple of months after the vaccine. I hope that Daniel finds more sales taking place both in retail and everything else, and there are good opportunities in the occupancy. And I'd like to thank Ofer, Andrew, John, Dan, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.